All right. Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Shabbat
Good morning.
shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
I'm excited. I like this portion. The funny thing is when I do Talmudim, for Shabbat school, I always am really excited about whatever passage we have. And Jeanette started teasing me and saying, I think they're all your favorite. I think every portion's your favorite. And I was like, fine. And so she said that to the kids last time we were with them. She and I were both there. She's like, who thinks this is one of Emma's favorites? Yeah. They're also well trained to know that Leviticus and Luke Acts are my favorite books. So they're all it's pretty funny.
I have the Talmudim today.
They're pretty fun. Okay. Well, most of you have helped yourself, but there are treats in the back. I have some up here. We'll see. I'll try not to eat and teach at the same time, but no promises. Okay. So we do have a double portion today, but it's still very short. So we're starting in Deuteronomy 29, verse 9. Though, now I'm forgetting. I think chapter 29, the verse numbering may be off by one. So if the verse I mentioned is not quite matching up, look one behind or one after. I can't remember which way it's off. One of these weird things that's different between the Jewish translations and the Christian ones. I don't know why they do that, but just to keep us on our toes, I think. So yes, I really do like this portion. This is about the time in Deuteronomy when I start to get really gooey and nostalgic because we're almost to the end of the Torah, which means we're saying goodbye to Moses. And I really like some of these final encouragements and warnings that we have here. And I found some really interesting things as I was reading through this time. So there's a couple things that I want us to notice, but I wanted to read a quote from God's Relational Presence, which still I'm saying is my best book purchase of 2022, even though I'm still reading it in 2023. But what I did actually is, because I have a reading schedule that I read through the Bible in a year. And it's one that is from a Messianic ministry, so it follows the Torah portion. So you read a section from all three sections of the Tanakh. So you read the Torah, the prophets, and the writings every day, and then it has the New Covenant as well. And it tracks with the holidays, so the books that you read on the holidays. So it's really kind of fun. So it starts at after Sukkot when we restart the Torah schedule. And so that's when I started this last year, was when we started the Torah. And I basically read it. That's why I have 4 bookmarks in here. Basically read each section of this book as I've read each part of the Bible, which has been really fun. So that's why it's taken me a year to read this, because I've read it with it. But it's been really, really cool to see how the authors kind of pull out this theme of God's desire for relationship and his presence among his people through the whole Bible. So it's really fun. It's a really good book. I know we've talked about it a lot. Rich and Tom have talked about it. But anyway, so I just wanted to give you, they kind of give a good, I feel like this was kind of a good summary statement. So I just kind of wanted to share this to start out with. So they said the book of Deuteronomy is restating the terms of the covenant that God made with Israel back at Mount Sinai and is calling Israel to covenant faithfulness. At the heart of the covenant is God's promise to dwell in the midst of his people, and thus the presence of God surfaces frequently in passages that discuss the terms of the covenant. And they go through and they bring out these different places where it talks about Israel being before the Lord, or being face to face, or just his presence being in there. And they even bring out in this portion, there's a couple different passages or covenant verses in chapter 29 in the very beginning of our portion that talk about basically all the people standing in the presence of the Lord. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we're reading these kind of final portions, is that all of this is kind of understood to be happening with all of the people in the presence of the Lord. So we have a lot of situations throughout the Torah where it's Moses, right? Moses is in the tent of meeting. Moses is face to face with God. But there is this reality that all of the people are in his presence. as these kind of final things are happening, and we even have even some more of this transfer to Joshua in this portion. This is going to drive me nuts. Using an iPad for my notes today because I am out of ink. But my iPad is very old, so it's like, why are you trying to use me for something other than a game or something? Anyway, so anyway, just keeping that in mind of just this reality that a lot of this is happening, and a lot of these reminders about the covenant are happening in the presence of the Lord with this emphasis on that significance. So I just kind of pulled out a few sections. We can talk about if there's anything that I skip over that stuck out to anybody, but there's just a lot of little sections that I find really striking in this portion. So we'll kind of jump around a little bit. But this is starting out again. Just what I was saying is even this whole emphasis of that they're standing before the Lord. So that's how our portion starts. That basically God is confirming them as his people. Verse 12 says, he will be your God just as he promised, just as he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Not with you alone, speaking to Moses, not to you alone am I cutting this covenant and this oath, but with whomever is standing here with us today before Adonai our God, and with whoever is not here with us today. And then he gives this kind of reminder and this warning. There's lots of reminders in this portion about remembering, and even in the previous portions we've talked about a little bit too, of remembering their time in Egypt and remembering that they were slaves, and therefore that's supposed to inform how they treat other people, right? So part of this reminder is like, you remember that you were in Egypt. They came out, and then verse 17, beware in case there is among you a man or a woman or family or tribe whose heart turns away today from Adonai our God, to go serve the gods of those nations. Beware in case there is among you a root producing poison and bitter fruit. So again, this is kind of going back, and we've talked about this before too, is like right there, because they're commanded when they go in the land or when they come up against another people group, what are they supposed to do? What are they supposed to do with all these elements of worship of other gods? Are they supposed to keep them?
No, utterly destroy them.
Utterly destroy them. They're supposed to tear down the high places. They're supposed to burn their Asherah poles. They're supposed to destroy the idols, throw them in the fire. They're not supposed to keep anything that is representing worshiping other gods, right? So, so there's this warning here that's basically being like, watch for anybody whose heart is turning to these other gods, because it's going to become like poison to you. Yeah.
Is it your understanding that's only in the land he's giving them, though? He does not command them to do that in territories outside that.
Right.
Land.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, he's commanding them to do that within the land. He would command them to do that in any situation where another group would be trying to come in. But again, it's about kind of this warfare over the land. Yeah, specifically because yes, while there is this understanding that all the other nations are welcome to come and worship God, it kind of is this is God's land and this is God's people, but they don't necessarily, they don't go out into these other territories necessarily to try to take over. Yeah.
When they are told to destroy all these other idols, the stuff made of silver and gold, is that considered tainted like blood money? So they can't melt it down and use it for something else then?
Well, sometimes that's unclear. They're supposed to destroy it, but it doesn't. But for instance, like, and this is a little bit of a different situation, but when they came out of Egypt, they had plundered the Egyptians, right?
That's true.
And what did they use all that silver and gold for?
Gold calf.
Well, they did use some of it for that, but they used all that silver and gold and bronze for the tabernacle.
Okay.
So, but they would still have to burn it and melt it down. So, so yeah, I think it's reasonable to understand that they would potentially melt it down and use it for something else, but it's not to remain as an idol. And I think that's also one of these practical things too, right? It's like, these are expensive metals that it's somewhat reasonable to think that they would repurpose it. It's just they're not to remain as something to be worshipped and something representing another god. So with these verses and this comment even about, they're basically saying that these people whose hearts turn away from Adonai toward other gods bring this kind of bitter root and this poison or this a root that is producing poison and bitter fruit, mixing words together. But because so basically they're kind of saying that this is going to spread, right? This worship of other things, if somebody is bringing that in, it's going to spread to other places. And actually, it reminded me of, and I couldn't find the exact quote, and I didn't have time to go back and watch the messages, but Rabbi Jerry's been talking about this orphan spirit the last couple of weeks. And one of the things he said, I believe it was 2 weeks ago in his message, was kind of that this orphan spirit or this orphan mindset becomes like a poison. It can poison your whole relationship with God, and that can spread, right? So basically it's this whole idea that not being submitted to the Lord, there starts to be this spread of this disobedience or rebellion. I remember talking about the rebellion of Korah, is that like all these people died because just a couple of people were rebelling against what God said and against God's order. And then all of a sudden you have like 15,000 people who ultimately die because this rebellion has spread. And the earth opens up and swallows all these rebellious people, and there's a plague that comes and all those things. But it also reminded me of, because I just happened to be reading Hebrews while I was reading some of this, and in Hebrews 12, Lori knows where I'm going. In Hebrews 12, I'm going to read a few verses because I think it's talking about a really similar type of situation. So it's talking, this is the section that it talks about running your race. And it talks about discipline. It talks about discipline from the Lord. So I'm going to read a couple paragraphs starting in verse 7. So Hebrews 12:7. It is for discipline that you endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son does a father not discipline? But if you are without discipline, something all have come to share, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Besides, we are used to having human fathers as instructors, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits, and live? Indeed, for a short time they disciplined us as seemed best to them, but he does so for our benefit, so that we may share in his holiness. Now all discipline seems painful at the moment, not joyful, but later it yields a peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Therefore strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble, and make straight the paths for your feet, so that what is lame will not be pulled out of joint, but rather be healed. Pursue shalom with everyone, and the holiness without which one will see the Lord, without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and see to it that no bitter root springs up and causes trouble, and by it many be defiled. Also see to it that there is no immoral or godless person like Esau, who sold his birthright for one meal. For you know that later, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected. He found no chance for repentance, though he begged for it with tears. So this sounds really similar, right? It's this warning again in Hebrews, not to let anyone with this that brings this bitter root among you, because many of people will be defiled. So it's spreading, but it also gives us hope, right? Because before that it said, where did it go? Yields, but this discipline of the Lord, if you receive it, this discipline of the Lord brings forth what? Brings forth a peaceful fruit of righteousness. So it's kind of really, this is one of the things I love about the Torah, is it kind of sets us up for everything else. Because Hebrews really is reiterating what we're seeing here at the end of Deuteronomy, right? It's this whole, like, if you choose life with the Father, you have there's going to be good fruit. And if you don't, there's going to be bitter fruit, and it's going to cause problems for a lot of people. So I just thought that was really interesting. And even this section about discipline, even though I don't know that we don't necessarily see the word discipline in Deuteronomy, that's really what we're talking about, right? We're talking about living a disciplined life before the Lord. He set up all this order and structure, right? Which in our modern world we like to see as all these rules and whatever. But it's unto what? It's unto relationship. That God is saying, if you live this way, it's going to go well for you. It's going to go well with your relationships with each other, and it's going to allow me to dwell in your midst. So like we need to keep that framework in mind as we're reading through a lot of these passages, and even a lot of these things here at the end of Deuteronomy when it's all this like, if you do this, you'll be blessed. If you do this, you'll be cursed. They say you have this choice set before you. It's one of the passages we'll get to in a minute. Of just, he's laid out the law like a good father, right? He's given them the rules, and he's given them the boundaries, how they're supposed to live, and he's like, and if you choose not to, this is what's going to happen, right? Which again is what a good father does, and really throughout the whole Torah, this is one of the things I see, and I see it especially in this portion, is that God is really showing himself as father to these people, right? And it's interesting, again, that Rabbi Terry's been talking about this orphan mindset, because what are the people of Israel when we start this journey? They're orphans. They don't have a land. They don't have any authority structure. They don't have anything. And God comes in and he dwells among them, and he's like, let me show you how to live. Let me show you how we do this together. And so we get to the end, and it's really like this. And we've kind of joked that Moses has been like kind of like the papa sending his kid off to college or something, and all these spinal reminders of like, okay, don't forget when you get there. Separate don't wash the red sock with all your whites. You're gonna have pink clothes, like like it feels a little bit like that, But it's also this fathering of like the Lord's like, all right, I've brought you through. We've moved through childhood. This analogy breaks down somewhere, so don't hold too closely to it. But I've brought you through childhood, and we're entering a new phase. So this is going to be, and Joshua's going to be the leader now, and things are going to look different. You're going to have to do some different things. You have more responsibility. You're responsible for what I told you. So here's this new kind of level of maturity that you're expected to move into. So there's I see very much a fathering happening through these passages. And one more thing on this section, and then if anybody has any comments, I'll open it up for that. So the verses right after this, verses 18 and 19 in Deuteronomy 29, it talks about, I'll just read it. So now when someone hears the words of this oath and in his heart considers himself blessed, thinking shalom will be mine, even though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart, thus sweeping away the moist with the dry, Adonai will be unwilling to forgive him. For then the anger of Adonai and his jealousy will smoke against that person. So all the oath that is written in this scroll will settle on him, and Adonai will blot out his name from under the heavens. Okay. And that last section has a lot of debate about what that means. I don't actually want us to go all the way down that trail today, though it is very interesting. But basically what they're saying in the beginning part of that section is there's this stubbornness that's like, I can have a good life by my own will, basically. And so, pause on that for a second. Let me remind us of this chiastic structure of the Torah that we have, right? Where we have this mountain structure. I almost reprinted the handout, and then I remembered I didn't have the ink, so I did print it. And but we have this mountain structure, right, where we have parallels of Genesis and Deuteronomy as the base level of the mountain, and then we have Exodus and Numbers as the midsection, and then Leviticus, of course, is the top of the mountain, with Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement, being the very summit of the mountain. So we've gone up and back down, right? The mountain. We're kind of back on this base level, but we're on the other side of it. So there are some connections back to some of this foundational reality, and that's another reason I like these portions. Is like a lot of this is really foundational very like broad level principles that God is reminding them of as they are ready to move forward. But we do have some connections back to some things in Genesis, and so what was standing out to me in this section about this condition of the heart, where basically what humanity is saying is like, I can figure out my own way, is very similar to the garden. This is what happens in the garden with Adam and Eve, right? The serpent comes, but is basically convincing them, if you eat this fruit, you'll be like God. And Dennis Prager was bringing this out as well, and he had this interesting comment about this. He says that once man thinks he is God, he no longer needs God. That is the eternal battle between human nature and the Bible. The Bible says God is necessary. Human nature says man's heart is enough. So it's back to this foundational reality as of like, whose will do you submit to? Do you submit to your own, or do you submit to the Lord? That's kind of this foundational issue. This is the question that we see starting in the garden and actually continues through all of Scripture. Is this, whose authority is better, God's or your own? And man's heart tends to lead themselves to believe that they can do it in their own strength. So I'll bring some. So I'll pause for a second there. Any comments, questions?
I have a small comment. Something that had kind of popped out to me this time that I hadn't seen so much before. The very beginning of that portion where it talks about you're standing today, all of you, and it lists off your children, your wives, and the outsider within your camp.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, each of you is to cross over into this covenant. So even the outsider that has chosen to align themselves, they're really not an outsider now, because they get to cross over into that covenant also.
Right.
And so again, we're starting to just see a little bit of a semblance of Israel and the nations in this, in a very small form. But if they align themselves, and I was thinking that orphan spirit, they're not on the outside constantly looking in, wishing, because he's right here told them, you're crossing over into this covenant also, if you've aligned yourself with these people. So you're part of the family.
Right. Yeah. I like that. I almost put that in my notes, and then I was like, well, we'll see if it comes up.
Yeah.
I should have known. Because it is this demonstration. It's like there's always kind of this. We tend to call it the mixed multitude, but there's always this mixture of in Israel and the nations are always welcome to come in, because there are people. There are Egyptians, or potentially even as they've been wandering in the wilderness and bumping up against some of these other people groups. There are people whose allegiance has turned, right? And this is saying basically anybody who's, I think we'll talk a little bit more. Well, even it goes with what we're saying here, is that he's still saying you can't worship God and other gods. But if your heart is fully allegiant to the God of Israel, you're welcome to follow him and be counted as part of Israel. So yeah, I like that. I liked that too, is that it's talking about, and it's even just as in this very covenantal, like this is like again, this is a retelling of the covenant, that the outsiders are there. It's not like, all right, all of Israel comes in, you guys wait over there till we're done. It's like, no, everybody comes. Everybody who's living this life together comes before the Lord together. So yeah, that's good.
I have a half-formed thought, but I'm not sure because it's only half-formed, and it would probably sound stupid.
I doubt that. But that's fine. If it becomes more fully formed,
I will share.
you can jump in. Okay, so the next couple verses, or really verse I wanted to talk about. So it goes on to talk about the rest of chapter 29 is kind of talking about some of the things that happened that will happen if they turn. What happens if they abandon the covenant, and all of that. So, which it talks about Adonai turning away, which is another, and that's what in this book, God's Relational Presence, that I mentioned at the beginning. That's one of the comments they make, is that as the consequences are laid out in this portion, that really the biggest consequence for disobedience and sin is that God usually says something like God turns his face away, but basically God's presence leaves. So that's actually the biggest consequence of their disobedience. And that plays out in a lot of ways, right? It plays out in they lose their protection, they get scattered among the nations, all these different things that happen, but really it's the result of the fact that God's presence is not with them. So that's a really interesting kind of tension there. But the verse I wanted to talk about a little bit is the very last verse. Laura's sitting over there watching me intently. Like, is she going to skip it? No, I'm not going to skip it. The very last verse of chapter 29. The secret things belong to Adonai our God, and the things revealed belong to us and to our children forever, in order to do all the words of this Torah. So, this is a good one. Do you have anything particular you want to say?
Well, there's two different ways to interpret that.
Yes. Which are?
Well, in the context of how this is written, there's two different ways I've actually heard it taught on too.
Mm-hmm.
First, it could just be the secret things belong to Adonai our God, and the things revealed belong to us, meaning God will show you what he's going to show you, and everything else is his secret type of thing. I've heard that teaching on it.
Mm-hmm.
The other teaching I've heard on it is concealed things that people do that aren't exposed. God deals with those. But if you see, and here's in the context of this, if you see this revealed sin, if you see this, the things that they've already been going through, you see somebody kill somebody, you see somebody, you're responsible to respond or react to that. So I was kind of curious, like, I have heard this, the secret things belong to God, and you're only supposed to worry about what you know or what he's revealed to you. But I've seen this community, the teaching of a community responsibility that let God deal with a person's secret sin. But if it's blatant sin in the community's responsible to deal with it. So I've heard it two ways.
Yeah, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think it can be both. Because I've heard both too, and I really kind of feel like I've seen kind of a blend of it, of just like, because again, there's the angle, there's, depending on which angle and which topic we're applying this to, which here it's talking about doing the words of the Torah, which means, I think it's reasonable, the second way that you were describing, of like, if the people see sin being carried out basically in their midst, the Torah has instructed them what to do, and they're responsible to do that. And again, God will deal with, if there's something hidden, God will deal with that. So I think in the context of Torah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And even within the context of that, there's also things that God has just not revealed about the why behind some of these things, right? That's why, like, you can read forever. I'm not actually suggesting you do this, but any of these, depending on where you look and what you're trying to find out. But it's like, the why, even with like dietary laws, it says, do you eat these and don't eat these? We don't really know why, other than God said. And people will say it's because of health reasons and because of all these things, but the reality is we don't know. It's just because God said so. Yeah, and again, there's all this fascination with the supernatural and with angels and the demonic and with all these other heavenly beings, which is fine. It's not that we shouldn't be interested in some of that, but some people will get so hung up on that they're like, I have to figure this out. And it's like, that's not what God didn't give us all that information. He gives us some. We know that angels exist. We know that angels show up to people. We know that God sends angels to do his work. And we can ask the Lord to do that. I would suggest if you're interacting with other beings, that you ask the Lord to do what He wants to do through those, and don't start commanding them yourself. But that's a side note. That's a side note little thing there. But the point is, there's all these things about how all these things work. Even going back to the tabernacle, we have all this instruction, but we don't really like. But like, this is why, like, people try to build it and they like don't actually know how, right? Like, it talks about, like, for example, the golden menorah. It's one solid piece of gold. No one knows how to do that. No one knows how to pour to create a gold structure that big out of one piece of gold. You can't do it, except for revelation of God. So there's these secret things that we have all this stuff that's written here, and but without God's interaction, you actually can't fully do it, if that makes sense. So all that to say, I think that so it goes back to this being responsible for what we know. And I think the New Covenant emphasizes exactly what Lori was saying, of just, it talks about, like, you're responsible to know what sin is and to act accordingly, both in your own life and when you see it in another. Like, we're not to tolerate sin, right? We know what sin is because of the Torah. And so we're not supposed to tolerate within our midst. And I think we see that even in the New Covenant scriptures as well. But there are also these things of God. But then there's also these great mysteries that it's like, we don't really understand His grand plan fully. We don't know what He's doing in certain situations until later, or sometimes never. And so it's just, it goes back to this. We have to hold that intention. And in some reality, we have to have that tension. Because if everything is explainable about God, He's not God. He is infinite and we are finite. So He must have something that we don't. By definition, yeah, Faith.
First of all, that was really good what you said about not going further than He wants us to go. Because you get into dangerous places if you do that, or try to seek after. Like, He was seeking after signs and wonders just for signs and wonders.
Right.
But I just agree with what you said. Like, God knows what He's going to choose to reveal to any generation, to any person, in His timing and in His way. So He's always going to have secret things that He has not yet shown us. And like you said, if we knew everything, we would need Him and we'd be God, and we wouldn't.
Yeah. And that's not to let this be like the scapegoat phrase of, like, if there's something we don't understand, well, it's just because we can't understand God.
Right.
We're supposed to be, it's like there's a verse, that says it's the glory of God to conceal Himself, and it's the glory of man to seek Him out. Right? So we're always supposed to be seeking and asking, and yet yielding to, He's only going to give us what we're supposed to have. And there are going to be things that are unexplainable. There are going to be things that we don't understand about how He works and why. So it's not meant to, I'm not suggesting that we have this as a scapegoat phrase of, like, oh, if I don't understand it, it's just because it's one of these concealed things, or, secret things of God.
To ask wisdom.
Yeah.
If anybody lacks wisdom,
exactly.
Ask it.
Right. But again, it goes back to this relationship, right? It goes back to this connecting with the heart of God, so that we can know what He wants us to know, and continuing to study the Word, to spend time in prayer, to spend time with each other, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot of things there. But I also want to point out too, it talks about the things revealed belong to us and our children forever, which goes back to the importance of sharing histories and sharing stories, right? The main example of this is, as we were talking about the Exodus story, it's commanded over and over again. Tell your children. You do the Seder every year so that every generation knows the story, right? And the tradition at the Seder is that the youngest child at the table asks these questions to who? The oldest person at the table, to hear the retelling of the story. And why did God bring us out? And how did He bring us out? And what does that say about us as a people? And so I think it's this, and it's even in our own family histories, right? This passing down of story from generation to generation is really important for people to know who they are. Dennis Prager talks about this a lot because he talks a lot about the breakdown of families and different things like that. That it's like no one knows their history, so you're missing this piece of your identity if you don't have any history. And so I think there's even that part of this too. It's like you have to continue to pass it down. You have to continue to engage with that to every generation.
Plus, like when you mentioned the Passover, the children ask questions. It's an encouraging children ask questions about God.
Right.
You know, I mean, this is like ask your elders about this because, like you said, they ask the. We've seen, and Jerry used it. Rabbi Jerry used an example of when Jeroboam and Rehoboam, the story there, asking the elders versus asking the peers.
Right.
And how the elders gave them wise advice, peers did not, and ultimately caused the split.
Right.
And so that practice of the children asking the older people, even in the Seder, is a really good practice to get of a way of training children to ask elders questions about God.
I get it. I do. And I have to question in my own mind if it's scripted, how much weight would it carry? And basically, that's what it is. It's scripted. You tell the child what to ask in this.
Sure. That's true. Yeah, in the context of the Seder, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you tell them.
But it's still encouraging kids to ask.
Right. Because I think, usually what happens, kids don't run out of questions, right? Kids usually have an endless supply of questions.
Yeah.
But I think, part of it is, and part of it in the Seder, yes, it is, and because it is instructed in the Torah to have the children ask these questions. So they're trying to obey Torah there. But I think it's also, I think it's a good idea to leave space for children to ask their own questions. Because, right, like, yes, in the Seder, it's like it's this process and you're telling them what to ask because you have a specific point and, you're sitting there for however many hours and you're like, can we eat dinner now? Can we find the afikoman and have some chocolate? Like,
Tell me what to ask, I'll ask it.
Exactly. But I think that there is something to, I think it is kind of what we're saying is it's pointing toward this, allowing children to ask questions. So yes, in that example, they're scripted, but I think it leads us to this understanding that we hope that they continue to ask more questions, that it builds a curiosity about God and about the stories and about the family and all of those things. But maybe the next Seder, you just let the kids say, okay, what question do you want to ask? And see if it's, when do we eat? Okay. All right. We'll move on a little bit here. Okay. So I love chapter 30. Even though there's a good portion of it that talks about curses. But it talks about setting the blessing and the curse before you, returning to the Lord, because this is again just kind of after talking about what happens when they abandon the covenant. But there's always this hope. But when you take part in all the nations where Adonai your God has banished you, this is the beginning of chapter 30, verse 2 now, and you return to Adonai your God and listen to his voice, according to all that I'm commanding you today, you and your children with all your heart and with all your soul, then Adonai your God will bring you back from captivity and have compassion on you. He will regather you from all the peoples where Adonai your God has scattered you. He goes on to continue to bringing him back into the land. And then verse 6, also Adonai your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love Adonai your God with all your heart and with all your soul, in order that you may live. So this is kind so hopefully this language is hitting your mind and taking you to the New Covenant scriptures, to Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36, of this circumcision of the heart, this writing the Torah on your heart, this heart engagement, and then ultimately to Yeshua. And it's interesting, some of the Jewish translations don't translate it that way. I can't remember. The translation that Prager uses doesn't say circumcise your heart. It says something else, and I can't remember what. And I wonder, doesn't say this, he doesn't say this, but studying what I've studied about how some of the Jewish writings developed parallel to the first couple centuries of followers of Yeshua, there's some language that's specific to not make those connections. And I wonder if this is one of those cases. I can't prove it, say it definitively, but like we say, like what should happen in our minds when we read circumcise your heart as believers in Yeshua is that should immediately connect us to the New Covenant, right? So I would suggest it's possible that some of these more traditional Jewish translations don't translate it that way so that we won't make that connection. But anyway, going back to what the verse is actually saying. But basically, it's this promise of basically God putting his word in our hearts. And it also reminds us, it should also bring us back to the Shema, right? And the Ve'ahavta, to love that Adonai your God with all your heart, soul, your strength, and all of those things as well. But I love that in order that you may live. So keep that in mind. We're going to keep going because I want to connect I want to kind of pull through a couple things. I'm actually going to skip to the end, and we're going to come back to a couple verses. But because we're on this theme of so that you may live. So at the very end of the chapter, starting in verse 15, see, I have set before you today life and good and death and evil. What I'm commanding you today is to love Adonai your God, to walk in his ways and to keep his mitzvot, statutes, and ordinances. Then you will live and multiply, and Adonai your God will bless you in the land you are going in to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not listen, but are drawn away and bow down to other gods and worship them, I tell you today that you will certainly perish. You will not prolong your days in the land where you are about to cross over the Jordan to go in to possess. I call the heavens and the earth to witness about you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore choose life so that you and your descendants may live by loving Adonai your God, listening to his voice and clinging to him. For he is your life and length of your days, that you may dwell in the land that Adonai swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give to them. So, this is a lot of repetition in these few verses, right? Blessing and curse, life and death, good and evil. And he's saying you can choose, right? And so Prager brought up this point. I thought it was really interesting. It's this contrast between choosing life and death, and we're like, who would ever choose death? But here's what he suggested, and I think this is an interesting way to think about this. Again, connecting back to the garden. So in the garden, the deception, right, was the instruction of God, right, was that they eat from the tree of life and that they don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? That was the instruction. So we can assume that as long as they eat from the tree of life, they don't die. So death doesn't exist in the garden, is the assumption that we make. But once they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but God tells them, if you eat from this other tree, then you will surely die. And the serpent goes, you're not going to die. You'll be like God. So what happens is obviously they eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which means they have to stop eating of the tree of life. So while they don't, I think sometimes my mind used to say this, and I've had to change it, is that because they eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and they don't drop dead right then and there, then it wasn't true. However, death now became a possibility. So eating that from the tree of knowledge means they have to stop eating from the tree of life. So now they will die. Death becomes inevitable. And as Jeanette likes to say, we have 100% mortality rate in humanity. Everyone will die, right? we are all moving toward death. I don't mean to make this really like morbid, but that's what ultimately has happened, right? That's actually the consequence, is that now they will not live forever. They will eventually die. So in this section, the connection I wanted to make here is that he's saying choose life or death. And we're like, well, of course they're going to choose life for as long as possible. And we see this throughout humanity, right? Is that people will do anything possible to live longer. But the choice that they're setting before them is about how they live, right? Because while they may choose life, they're supposed to be choosing, it says, therefore, choose life so that you and your descendants may live. So the modern parallel, this is what I think is really interesting. Just a second, let me make this point and I'll come back to you, I promise. The connection that Dennis Prager is suggesting is that in the modern world we have severely decreased birth rates, typically in many countries, and marriage rates. So there are some populations, some countries, where the birth rate is not replacing the population, which means ultimately, what direction is that nation heading? They're heading towards death. Like if they can't replace their population, eventually that nation will die effectively. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So, and he brings out the point of like devout religious people, really across the board. We see it in Muslim, we see it in Judaism, we see it in Christianity. Devout religious people have bigger families, right? And so that's an interesting connection, and it's this choosing life. And this is not just an abortion slogan, though that's an important topic, but it's about like having importance of family, right? And in my generation, we see severely decreased marriage rates, even because it's not been something that's been emphasized as important. So there are consequences to this. So that's Prager is suggesting that's part of what's being suggested here is even how you view what you value. It's not just about like, well, of course I want to live, but it's like thinking about holistically the corporate reality of life and death. So I thought that was really interesting, and I thought that was an interesting perspective on this, especially as they're talking about going into the land, and they're talking about the longevity of the people of Israel in the land. So there's that. What you got, Stan?
It's a question. In the New Testament, redemption is a major focus. Does it mention it anywhere in the Old Testament at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see the principle of redemption. I don't know that it uses that word, but I think we see that even in this, as it talks about, when they've been disobedient and they're scattered among the nations, and then their hearts turn back, and he brings them back and he restores them and redeems them back to their land. So I think I see redemption more in that context of they're like we always see this kind of back and forth pattern, and we see it play out throughout the rest of the Tanakh with all the different kings and things like that. The obedient king, the blessing is restored, and there's redemption to the people, and they're able to make progress in the things of the Lord. And then there's a generation that doesn't, and things don't go so well. But I think there's always the promise that he always promises he's going to bring them back. So in that's how I see redemption playing out in the Torah and in the rest of the Old Testament, is that he always promises that to bring them back to the land.
I would say, even beginning in Genesis with the covering, the theme of redemption is all through Scripture and through the prophets, especially Isaiah. For the Lord is your Redeemer. There's no Redeemer besides the Lord. Pointing to Yeshua.
Yeah, and I think too, kind of going off of what you're saying there, is even from the garden, is that's another connection. I'm glad you said that. I'd forgotten, even though it's in my notes, I think. But this is another connection that we have of even just at this point in the grand narrative. If we look at the whole story of Torah, of going from the garden, from them being exiles from the garden, we are on this. Throughout the whole Bible, we're on this trajectory back toward the garden, right? That's what, like if you look at the grafted course the whole thing is set on the kingdom family timeline, and it's this garden to garden reality. It's from the Garden of Eden to the New Jerusalem Garden City. So ultimately, that's where we're going. But here at the end of the Torah, as they're about to enter the land, there's this thought of that this is a redemption back to, because there's some of the language about the land is similar to, or seems to allude to, Eden. That we have at least a partial, we have a big step toward the redemption back to how God originally designed things with the people of Israel, with God's chosen people in His land, with His presence among them. Because that's very much, He's promising to dwell with them in the land as long as they are faithful to Him, much like He is present with them in the garden, as long as they are faithful to that one instruction He gave them. Which, of course, we see both in the garden and in the history of Israel. There comes a point when we're not faithful to that, but there is this ultimate promise of full redemption that we are moving toward. Okay.
On the choice for life or death, and even in here where he talks about prospering the work of their hand and the fruit of their womb, on that line of multiplication, like you said, with tying that in, even when you look, like in the book of Numbers, where we have the two different census, and you look at the amount of people that were at Mount Sinai, but then the only group, the only tribe that increased in numbers and actually prospered that 40 years were the Levites, who were ministering unto the Lord. The rest of them, their numbers went down. And part of me wondered, like, if this is also a thought process of theirs, like, we were more 40 years ago than we are now. So if we want to be fruitful, if we want our wombs, if we want to have a bunch of kids to live in this land, to get our numbers back up, to increase our population again, He's telling them, follow me. And I can almost see it, like, look at what the Levites, they're serving me.
Yeah,
and they're being fruitful. But the rest of you, your numbers have gone down.
Yeah.
And this kind of ties into that same thing. You can make these choices, and you can prosper, and the fruit of your womb will be multiplied, or you can choose to go this other way, and you're not going to see this.
Right. I think that's really good. I think also along with that is, I really like what you're saying. I think that's really important. And also what just came to mind as you were talking was just that was also all the plagues and all the people that died in the plagues. So also although that we've seen, a net decrease, we also know that we've lost really large numbers of people at times. So really, those numbers should have probably decreased more. So there's this tension of the consequence for disobedience and rebellion, and also redemption, I would say, and faithfulness of the Lord when they do turn back and we're like, oh yeah, that was a bad idea. That while they still have this net decrease, it probably is not as much as it should be. They have replaced to some level to where they're still, recognizable, all these different tribes and all these different numbers. So we see this principle playing out is what we can conclude from that, which is really interesting. Okay, we only have a few minutes. Which one do I want to do? Okay, so I want to go back a little bit. So we're not really going to get to much of chapter 31, which is the second half of this portion. But in chapter 30, I want to jump back just a little bit to verse 11. Because again, it's just kind of talked about a redemption cycle. So it's kind of brought us through the last part of chapter 29 and through chapter 30 has brought us through this cycle of disobedience, and curse and back to this obedience that he's now saying, and when you turn back, and I'll bring you back to the land, and you'll have good produce and all these different things. And it's all because, verse 10, when you listen to the voice of Adonai your God to keep his mitzvot and his statutes that are written in the scroll of the Torah, when you turn to Adonai your God with all your heart and with all your soul. In verse 11, for this mitzvah I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you, nor is it far off. It is not in the heavens that you should say, who will go up for us to the heavens and get it for us, and have us hear it so we may do it. Nor is it across the sea that you should say, who will cross over for us to the other side of the sea to get it for us and have us hear it so we may do it. No, the word is very near to you, in your mouth and in your heart, to do it. So, again, it's this emphasis of that this is possible. It's this life that he's asking them to live is actually possible. He's actually given them what they need to live as he wants them to. And it also goes back to this, and I like these verses too, because I think sometimes people talk about the mysteries of God. It's like how we don't know how to please him. We don't know what to do. It's like he's actually said it. He's actually not trying to trick us, right? He's asking us to be faithful, and he's asking us to do what he said. And I think I want to say it's Talmud, but I've heard said before, it's like the new covenant says we're going to have the Torah written on our hearts. So Lord, just put the Torah on your heart, and the Lord will respond, well, can you help me out? Can you actually read it? Yes, the Lord can supernaturally put things in us, for sure. I totally believe he does that. And I believe that even he's kind to, in certain moments, I've had this happen, and I've seen this happen to other people. He'll bring to mind a verse that you maybe haven't thought about in years. But it's helpful if you've at least read it, right? And so it's this partnering with the Lord, right? It's like, it's a lot easier to be faithful when you actually know what he's asking you to be faithful to. So all that to say, I find this encouraging, and I also find it really, I think that this is significant. An important thing for us to remember about God is that he wants us to know how to be with him. He wants us to know how to be in relationship with us. He wants us to know how to live a faithful life. He wants us to know how to relate to each other. So yeah, it's this idea that we actually get to do it together. And it's not this, it's often, I have to have this heavenly encounter to know what he's actually saying, or I have to go to these great lengths. It's like, no, it's actually right here. And I like too that it talks about, this scroll of the Torah. Where did they keep the scroll of the Torah? Ark. I think it's technically, they say it's next to the ark, which I was reading some about that, which is interesting. But yeah, it's in the tabernacle, which is the center of their life. So it's like, right, if they keep their life oriented around the right thing, which is the presence of God and worshiping God, then the word is, that's what it's saying, is that the word is, you have access to this. And again, this is a very oral culture, so this is being read, which it goes on to, we won't really have time to really talk about this. But in chapter 31, that's why it commands these public readings, right? Because also they know that once they get in the land, everybody's going to be spread out enough that they're not going to be together every day or every week or whatever, right? They're gonna be together when they come up for the coming up festivals, and that's why it mentions Sukkot, which is interesting, right? That we're coming up on Sukkot here. And this is every 7 years, actually, that they read the whole Torah, because the people need to know what they're supposed to be being faithful to, right? So they would have teaching throughout the year as well, because some of the Levites live with all the tribes, right? And they are the ones who are commanded to study when they're not actively serving in the tabernacle. They're living among the people, so they would probably be doing some teaching and things as well. So it's not like this is their one shot, but the point is that the word of the Lord is housed with the presence of the Lord and in the tabernacle. And so he's saying you have access to this. So you just keep that in mind and keep the central thing central, and you can totally live this life that I've commanded you. So I find that encouraging, as it seems, especially even like thinking about these people about to go in and conquer this land that's been promised, and there's still this nation that's much smaller than all these other nations, of basically God saying, you have everything you need to live the life I've called you to live. So I find a lot of encouragement in that. Despite the fact that it's kind of set in the middle of this kind of prophetic announcement that they are going to be disobedient.
Yeah.
You know, because that's really chapter 31. It's like setting in Joshua, and you know he's the one who's going to lead you, but actually Adonai's going to lead you, right? Like it's very clear to say that in the beginning of chapter 31. I'll just kind of sum this up really briefly because we need to end. But when the blessing kind of goes to Joshua, it's like, yes, he's the leader of the people. And one of the reasons, which we know the story about the rock and Moses taking credit for what God did to bring them water, but and that's why God says he can't enter the land. But really, like Moses can't enter the land because they'll worship him. Like they'll rely too much on Moses. That's what most people understand is part of why Moses couldn't go into be the one to lead them into the land, because they'll start to develop this idea that we can't function without him. And so he sets Joshua in, who's a very different type of leader, but the one that God chose. So he's a very good leader, but he plays a very different role in Israel. But it says in chapter 31, verse 8, Adonai, he is the one who goes before you, and he will be with you. He will not fail you or abandon you. Do not fear or be discouraged. So it's really the Lord, and we see this play out in Joshua as they enter the land, that the Lord of Adonai Tzebaot, the Lord of hosts, is the one who goes before them. And so they're setting up this whole, like, you have to follow the Lord. Like, it's about following the Lord, not following the person, right? Not that Moses is not significant in the story, in the way that he shows us how to partner with the Lord is really significant. But then, yeah, he goes into this whole thing that basically, you know, talks about Moses is about to die, and the people are gonna, you know, the people are gonna go after other gods, and they're gonna do all the wrong things, basically. And Adonai's gonna turn his face from them again, which goes back to this. The greatest consequence is actually that the presence of God leaves. And he just, you know, it's a very sobering reality. It's like, I'm bringing you into this land, and you're going to screw it up at some point. You're going to have to leave, but I'm always going to bring you back. And so we end this portion with, we end this portion with this introduction to the Song of Moses, which is next week's portion, which has the purpose of the people of Israel are supposed to learn this song so that they know, so they remember the word of the Lord, and that they remember what God has done and what he's doing in their midst and what he requires of them. So it's giving them a very practical strategy for remembering, which is what ultimately will bring them back, even in the, you know, like the faith of God is greater than our faith, is that he has faith in these people that even though they're going to be disobedient and they're going to be scattered among the nations, eventually something's going to catch their heart and they're going to come back to the Lord. They're going to turn back and they are going to remember and come back to him, which is a really good thing. So, we will not have Torah study next week because we won't have service next week. We have service Friday evening for Rosh Hashanah, and then we have a time with Matt Rudolph on Saturday evening, but no service on Saturday morning, so we will not have Torah study. So Lord, we thank you for your presence. We thank you that we are coming up to this holiday season, and we thank you that we are going to get to experience your presence in a greater way. We ask that you would just protect everybody in the community, that you would protect against any sickness or any other issues that tend to like to pop up during this season. So we just ask that you would protect our community and protect our leaders, Lord. We thank you for the hard work of everyone that has gone into helping prepare for these holidays. And we ask that you prepare our hearts to engage with them fully as well. And we ask that your presence would be with us in service, and that we would know how to worship and honor you on this Shabbat. We thank you for Shabbat and for your presence drawing closer to us and this day of rest and this time together.